The morning air was crisp and biting, the scent of damp earth and pine filling Chloe's lungs as she trudged through the undergrowth. Her boots sank slightly into the mud, but she was used to it. Life in the wild demanded resilience. Every morning was the same. Wake before dawn, check for traps, sell the catch, survive another day. Today was no different. Her fingers brushed against the hilt of her knife at her hip, a habit more than anything. The woods could be unpredictable, a hungry wolf, a desperate thief, even something worse. But she had learned to navigate it all, had made her living by it. Checking her traps was second nature now. She knew exactly where she had set them, the paths the animals traveled, the subtle signs of movement in the grass. The first few snares had proven successful. 2 rabbits and a fox. Not much, but enough to eat for a couple of days. Maybe even sell the fox pelt for a little coin. Still, it wasn't enough to make the trip back just yet. She had set another snare a little deeper into the woods, and if luck was on her side, it would be a big catch. That was when she heard it. A faint, wavering noise. Soft, like a lamb's cry. A bleat. Chloe froze. A deer. That didn't make any sense. This deep in the woods, deer were cautious. She had never heard one make a sound like that before, and the tone, it wasn't just a caw, it sounded distressed. Her grip tightened on her knife as she followed the sound, stepping carefully through the undergrowth. It wasn't long before she found herself near the last snare she had set, and that's when she saw it. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. There, just beyond the trees, sat a tiny creature. It had the shape of a fawn, its body covered in soft brown fur speckled with white. But it wasn't just a deer, it was something else entirely. It sat upright, like a child, its small hands wrapped around its own throat, desperately clawing at something tied around its neck. One of her snares. Chloe's breath caught in her throat as realization hit her. The creature let out another bleat, louder this time, its wide blue eyes filled with panic. It was suffocating. She had caught it. But what had she caught? She took a hesitant step forward, boots crunching against a twig. The moment the sound reached its ears, the creature's head snapped towards her. Its cries became frantic, desperate. Chloe could see the fear in its eyes. It wasn't just an animal reacting on instinct. It was aware. It knew what fear was. Her pulse quickened. Her first instinct was to turn away, to leave. This thing, whatever it was unnatural. She had spent her life hunting normal game, not this. But then she saw how raw the skin beneath the snare had become, the way its tiny body trembled and the sheer terror in its gaze. And something inside her shifted. Cursing under her breath, Chloe moved forward. The creature's cries only grew louder as she approached, as if begging someone, anyone, to come and save it. But no one was coming. It was just Chloe. And there was no time to hesitate. She dropped to one knee and reached for the snare. The little thing thrashed wildly, struggling against her touch. Even as small as it was, it made it difficult for her to free it. She had to act fast. Hold still, Chloe muttered, using her free hand to gently but firmly press the creature down. It was warm, its tiny chest rising and falling rapidly against her palm. With practiced precision, she pulled her knife free and sliced through the snare. The moment the tension was released, the creature gasped, or at least that was the closest thing Chloe could compare it to. It wasn't quite a human sound, nor was it fully animal. It was something in between. Its bleating didn't stop, however, but it wasn't struggling as much anymore. It was still afraid, but it was alive. Chloe sat back on her heels, taking in the strange little thing before her. Now that it wasn't fighting for air, she could really look at it. The tiny creature, the fawn, the child, the whatever the hell it was, stared at Chloe with wide, teary eyes. Its breaths came in short, shuddering gasps, little chest rising and falling so fast it looked like it might pass out. Chloe swallowed hard. What the hell was she supposed to do now? If this had been a normal deer, she'd have let it go. Animals got caught in her traps all the time, and if they were too young or not worth the trouble, she'd free them. But this thing wasn't normal. It wasn't just looking at her, it was watching her. Chloe sat back on her heels, keeping her knife in her grip. The little fawn still trembling, its ears flicking at every tiny noise in the forest. She studied it. It was tiny, barely the size of a human toddler. Its fur was soft, thin in places where patches of pale, almost human-like skin peeked through. Its fingers, actual tiny fingers, curled into its chest as if trying to protect itself. Most unnerving of all were its eyes. Big, blue, intelligent. Like a child's. A cold breeze rustled the trees, making the leaves shift and murmur like distant whispers. The little fawn shivered violently, curling in on itself. Chloe exhaled sharply. She should leave it. She should just stand up, turn around, and go. It wasn't her problem. It wasn't her responsibility. The creature wasn't natural. And yet, her moment of quiet contemplation was interrupted by a howl in the distance. Low, deep, and too close. The fawn flinched violently, its entire body stiffening. Its tiny frame quaked and a high-pitched bleat escaped its throat, a sound of pure terror. Chloe felt her stomach turn to ice. Wolves. Her eyes darted towards the trees. Shadows moved between them, sleek bodies weaving silently through the underbrush. 1, 2, 3. Shit. Another howl, this time from a different direction. Chloe's breath hitched. More than 3. The fawn let out another frightened cry and did something that almost broke Chloe's heart. It covered its face with its hands, tiny, trembling fingers pressed against its wide eyes, as if not seeing the danger would somehow make it disappear. It was still afraid of her, but the terror of the wolves was stronger even so. It made no move towards her, only huddled into itself, shivering violently. This thing is not going to survive on its own, Chloe thought. The wolves were closing in, their eyes glinting like slivers of silver in the dim light. Their heads were low, their bodies moving in slow, calculated steps. They weren't just hunting, they were stalking. Chloe didn't have time to think. She lunged forward and scooped the fawn up in her arms. That's when the struggle began. The tiny creature flailed violently, twisting and squirming in her grip. Its hooves kicked at her chest, weak but desperate, and it let out a piercing panic cry that rang through the trees. Chloe winced, nearly losing her grip. The little thing had no idea she was trying to save it. It only knew it was being taken. Damn it, kid. Stop squirming. It didn't. If anything, it fought harder, wrenching its body in a frantic bid to escape. Chloe adjusted her grip, locking her arms around it, keeping its hooves pinned before they could land a real hit. It whined, breath coming in short, choked gasps. Behind them, the wolves moved. No more slow approach, no more cautious steps. They charged. Chloe ran. She tore through the trees, branches whipping at her face, boots pounding against the ground. The fawn's small body squirmed against her, but Chloe held on with everything she had. The wolves were snarling now, their breath coming in rapid huffs. She could hear their paws tearing through the underbrush, hear the snap of twigs beneath their weight. They were fast, too fast. She didn't dare look back. She didn't need to. She could feel them behind her. Their presence loomed, their hot breath practically ghosting over her skin. The fawn suddenly went silent. Chloe risked a glance down, barely catching sight of wide, terrified eyes staring up at her. The little creature was clinging now, fingers grasping at her coat, its small chest heaving. It had stopped fighting, realizing too late that she was its best chance at survival. A snarl, too close. Chloe ducked just in time. A wolf lunged, jaws snapping where her shoulder had been mere seconds ago. She felt the rush of air, the presence of its body as it soared past her, missing by inches. It hit the ground, recovered fast, and sprang after her again. She pushed harder. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed in protest. The cold bit at her face, at her fingers, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. A second wolf lunged. This time, Chloe twisted her body at the last second, narrowly avoiding its snapping teeth. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a wild drum of panic and adrenaline. Almost there, she thought frantically. She could see the clearing ahead, the faint outline of her cabin in the distance. So close. Another wolf lunged. Chloe felt something graze her leg, a sharp brush of teeth against leather before she wrenched herself away. It hadn't bitten through, but it had been damn close. Too close. Her foot caught on an exposed root. For one terrifying second, she stumbled, the weight of the fawn throwing her off balance. She caught herself at the last moment, using sheer force of will to keep from crashing into the ground. The cabin was right there. With one final desperate push, she sprinted forward and slammed into the wooden door and practically threw herself inside. She kicked it shut, pressed her back against it just as something heavy slammed into the other side. The impact rattled the door. Chloe let out a choked gasp, her entire body shuddering. The fawn in her arms whimpered, pressing its face into her chest. Outside, the wolves growled, claws scraping against the wood. They paced, snarling, circling, but they couldn't come inside. They wouldn't. Not with the scent of fire and steel thick in the air. Not with the barrier between them still holding. Still, Chloe stayed put. Her body trembled, her breath coming in ragged gulps. Her heart slammed against her ribs, the ghosts of snapping teeth still fresh in her mind. She didn't move until she heard the wolves retreat, slow at first, then fading into the distance. Only when she was sure they were gone did she let out a shuddering breath. Her body slid downward, her back dragging against the door until she was sitting on the floor, legs sprawled out in front of her. Her hands ached from clutching the fawn so tightly, her arms felt numb, her entire body hurt. But none of that mattered. The fawn was shaking. Chloe looked down, her chest tightening at the sight. The tiny creature was curled into itself, still trembling, still terrified. Its breathing was shallow, erratic. It hadn't moved, hadn't tried to escape. It just clung to her, fingers weakly grasping the fabric of her coat. Chloe swallowed hard. What the hell had she just done?